I'd like to also thank Crystal Lee and Jennifer Gao for organizing, I understand, this entire series, but making my visit and arrangements so easy and exciting. So my plan for today is indeed to pick up some of the themes that I've taught at UC Berkeley on the problems and possibilities of thinking about modern art and architecture in the Islamic world. And let me just open right up. I'll explain what I mean by problems and possibilities in 1 second, but let's start with an example of a painting by an Iraqi artist named Shakar Hassan El Said. It's called The Victors. It's made out of mixed media, and it's been painted on panel. It's relatively large. It's 122 centimeters by 101 centimeters. And there are a number of elements about this painting that suggest its significance and appropriateness for thinking about modern art in the Islamic world. You might notice immediately its format. I describe this as mixed media on panel. What we have here is a bounded, flat art object, recognizable as a sort of idiom of modern art in the world. It's tradable, it's movable, right? What it doesn't have is figural representation, and this is a thematic that I'm also going to be thinking through with you today. So Shakar Hassan El Said, an Iraqi painter, was born in the 1920s, grew up through a period of intensive modernization in Iraq, was a member of a number of modern art groups, and in the 1970s turned to what he himself described as a sophistic mode of painting. This is a practice that he described as contemplative, and his approach to the surface of the art object was to think of it as a kind of opening to the world. So in turning the painting surface, which typically we think of as a space for sort of representing the world by a reflective relationship, making representations that resemble objects out there, Shakar Hassan El Said placed the canvas on the ground and worked on it as if it were a wall surface, open to light. This was the way that he approached it and thought about it. He developed a philosophy that he called the one-dimension philosophy. And that philosophy was deeply committed to another philosophical and theological commitment that we associate with Islam, which again I'm going to work through the course of this talk. And that's the idea of monotheism. Monotheism expressed in the sentence, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God." When this affirmation of the unity of God is spoken, it underscores the sort of totality of God's power, and that totality of God's power can make the very act of painting a rather fraught, complex, and also satisfying activity. If God is the only God, what does it mean when a human being on earth places or creates an aesthetic object, brings it into the world? Is that some kind of challenge to the supreme monotheistic powers of the single God in heaven? Shakar Hassan El Said thinks about that problem in a painting like this, where the process of making it is layers and layers over years of production, as a kind of contemplation of the power of being. This is how he describes it. He's not creating, he's affirming the power of God in a kind of sophistic, reflective mode, which is then further underscored by the fact that the letters of the Arabic alphabet are added here as if to take the place of where we might expect a figure to go. So, oops, oh, sorry. Also warned about this. At our very center, we have a single letter, the waw. We have here a letter meme, and we have other hints of letters that haven't even yet taken form. Here the letters are sort of separated from the meaning that they would have in words and are made to be a kind of presence, and that presence again points to an entity, a kind of greater entity that extends beyond the painting plane. So again, the actual, gosh, I'll get used to this, the actual surface of the painting then, right, becomes a register of energies and powers in the world, built up by this artist who sees his approach as being that of ramification and amplification, and his relationship to other systems of representation like text as something where he sort of plucks or picks those elements out of the alphabet and places them onto the surface as then the new center of our own contemplation and attention. You'll probably notice, if you're looking at this as I queued it up, as a paradigm of a kind of modern Islamic art made in a register of religious belief, you probably also saw this hint of a crescent moon and other motifs. But again, those motifs are placed beside other scratches. This is number 3, and other sort of hints of lexical meaning, all of which again we're invited to consider them as components that might come together in order to speak in a revelation of this greater power. So this, from 1983, in many ways represents a kind of consummation of a certain idea of modern art in the Islamic world. It's from relatively late when we think about the period of modernity, right? The 1980s is almost a sort of entry into a contemporary kind of circulation where economies and interconnectedness and even the digital age is on the way. So in a certain sense, it's an endpoint for us as well. For the rest of the talk today, I'd like to go back to the start of the 20th century and to think about some of the challenges that I just highlighted that this painting seems to resolve, or at least pose itself as a solution to, and follow those in time. Think about the entry of modernity, and in particular, the entry of electrical power and light as elements that already were present in the world, but which are channelized in particular ways and used by artists in the Islamic world as they engage in practices of representation. I have one other set of prefatory points to make, and that is that in order to prepare for the lecture today, I spent time looking through the wonderful collections of the Asian Art Museum. And the majority of pieces that we could suggest come from the Middle East, the region that I know a lot about, are all from precisely this threshold date of around 1900. And what's interesting, and I'll show them to you now, is that most of them in their formal language would not, I'm sort of guessing, but presumably you would not relate to this image as a modern image per se in its formal language. This is a page of calligraphic practice, which is dated in the museum catalog as between 1700 to 1900. I suspect it's from the later 1800s. It's ink, colors, and gold on paper. And this is a sheet resembling in its format. It has at the top, here at the top, the phrase Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which is the opening phrase in every surah of the Quran. It's the sort of inaugural statement in order to bring listeners into attention to prepare for a revelation. And at the bottom, we have that declaration of monotheism that I had recited to you. There is no God but God. In the center, there are other reports of what Muhammad said and did from a collection of authoritative testimonies that we call the hadith. And as a totality, this is actually a page from a calligrapher's portfolio in order to authenticate the skill within set scripts that a calligrapher in the Ottoman register would be expected to perform perfectly. So there are innumerable certificates like this. We sometimes call them the ijaza, and they contain those components: the Bismillah written beautifully, the Shahada written beautifully, selected testimonies and hadith content, and then the same calligrapher would have most likely also done the illumination on the piece. What the two that I just showed have in common, I would suggest, is a commitment to these chains of authority, where the artist is operating in a much larger social and religious register, where the individual entry, the kind of artistic work, is significant because of its furthering and upholding of these existing conventions of expertise and aesthetic satisfaction. This is another piece from the Asian Art Museum. It's another Bismillah page. This one has very little information. We think it's from 1880. And here, interestingly enough, we again have that same Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me show you side by side. You see the dot beneath the letter form here. This is the ba, and then the sin, and then the long ligature to connect to the meme. Here we have the ba with the dot underneath. This dot is the same as this dot. Then we have the points for the sin, and then the meme hanging down like this. That's the same as this letter. So the conjunction of these two certificates show the ways in which letter forms, standard, become carriers for the perfect interrelations that the calligrapher can pull out and play with as a technician, totally honed in and keyed into the beauty of the testimony to the greatness of God. This is religious art that at the same time takes that religious convention, everyone's familiar with the Bismillah, and takes it as a groundwork for expressing these tremendous acts of aesthetic composition, right? The two fonts, to use a much more contemporary term, or if we say the scripts, are wildly different. They actually, I believe, have utterly different formal effects upon us. The one on the left, this one, looks highly modern in its graphic capabilities. All of the ornament that would have framed it by the illuminator has been excised, and we just have the power of that black declaration of presence on this white background. The one other piece that seemed relevant to me that I wanted to use a threshold for my talk today is this. This is a Qajar wall tile from the Qajar dynasty in what is now Iran, what was then Persia, and it's contemporaneous with what I just showed you, right? So this is from 1875. They're dating it between 1875 and 1910. This is a Fritware tile. It's been glazed. The caption in Persian reads, Sultanat Majlis Yusuf. So it's referring to a meeting of two different types of authority. In the top register of this tile, we see the monarchy, or the royal assembly. And we can recognize that because the Shah is shown sitting on a particular kind of throne. This is the throne that's preferred in the Qajar period. It's a low platform. We're going to see it again come up in photographic representation, so we're building up our sort of awareness and ability to recognize that iconography. And notice that the king's legs are folded under in the kind of conventional pose for sitting on this kind of monarchical throne. And what this tile is actually doing by labeling the Sultanate ahead and the Majlis Yusuf below is queuing up what was actually going on in the Qajar dynasty, which was a debate over how political representation was supposed to work. There, in 1906, there was a movement and a set of protests demanding the establishment of a majlis. And a majlis is a more representative body where members representing different communities would come together and petition and actually engage with the seat of power in order to request that their needs be met. So this tile, to me, offers us a perfect sort of antinomy. If we were looking at very conventional artwork that takes conventions of sort of time-honored calligraphic content and uses it to innovate form, in the next image, we actually, interestingly enough, have a figural representation in a relatively straightforward and simple graphic language, showing people in primary colors, sort of sketching them out almost as cartoons, and content that is all about change. A kind of dispute or debate or sense that modes of political representation is going to have to change. So in this, for the rest of the talk, I want to think about that interesting divide or struggle between the content of a modern artwork, speaking somehow to conditions of rapid change, made ever more rapid under processes of modernization, and then the question of form. How are these artworks actually bodying either change or a desire for continuity forth into a visual register? How can we pick that up and attend to it ever more closely as analysts of visual information? These tiles, I guess the final point to make, make about them is that the royal court in the Qajar dynasty in Persia was the preferred form of external monumental decoration were these kinds of tiles, these fritware tiles, decorated with a mix, as you can see, of text, of representations of floral information rendered into surface design, and then figures present either as courtier-like figures attending to the space that one might enter, or as actually representations of the Shah himself. So this is Muzaffar Shah, the final Shah before the Pahlavi dynasty begins. All right. Given this information, how do we think through a lot of the purported truisms of Islamic art? Probably one of the biggest ones that's bandied forth and used to establish sites of contestation over images is the claim that figural imagery is somehow banned, forbidden, frowned upon in Islamicate settings. We already have, obviously, counter evidence. And in fact, the entire history of Islamic art is filled with counter evidence. Artists were always making representations of humans. Often in a popular register, there would be, there's a whole convention of sort of riders on their mounts, on horses, consistent from the earliest instances of manuscript illustration in the Arab world, which was mentioned as the sort of what brought me into Islamic art in the first place. We have representations of human beings. So what is the actual problem for us if we're trying to think about the place and valences of images in the Islamic world? As I already queued up, it's this idea that there's no God but God that seems to establish the philosophical point at which any individual artist's creation and production might become a problem, or might become a ritualistic relationship to the world. Somebody making an image could be seen as challenging God, or could be seen as reflecting the greatness of God. And this is, in many ways, there are analogs in Christian art as well. Whether an artist is becoming a sort of humanist figure, taking the place of God and claiming the right to create for themselves, or whether, again, human beings are sort of using their technical skill in order to produce affirmations of this important figure. Now, this threshold, or this point, where we can enter into a space of questioning of what an artist is even supposed to do, becomes ever more wonderfully complicated when the camera is introduced. The camera is a device, when it was invented, that in many ways, that in many ways seemed to remove the humanness of the act of creating an image, right? A camera is a room or a box where the aperture is opened, light comes in, the light has bounced off objects in the world, and it casts their shadow or their register onto a photographic plate or a paper surface, where chemicals then do the work of fixing that presence via light. All that a human being has to do, again, in our sort of technical conception of philosophy, is to press a trigger and to open that aperture. What I'm showing you here, and let's take that circuit and that kind of technical relationship to heart when we look now at a series of images from the Ottoman context. So the same Ottoman dynastic context where we saw the Ijaza calligraphy testifying to an individual calligrapher's ascent into the perfect conventions of how to render the Bismillah. In the same period, I'm showing you this painting from the 1890s, an oil on canvas work by an unknown artist who's representing the Yildiz Mosque in Istanbul. This is an Ottoman Imperial mosque that was constructed under Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II and constructed between 1884 and 1886. The reason we don't know the name of the artist is that this oil painting operated in a register of military training. The modern military schools of the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s included extensive training in oil painting as part of the studies for men who wanted to become officers. They also studied mapping and other modes of sort of relating to the world, where a good soldier or a good officer had to be able to take that information and render it into some kind of lasting map or testimony to things in the world. Now, fascinatingly, every year, the military academies collected the best paintings and presented them to the Sultan. The Sultan sort of accepted them, complimented them en masse, and entered them into the sort of royal storehouses in the palace complexes of the sort of Ottoman Sultanate. Now, oil painting, as we think of it as a technology for rendering images onto flat canvases, is typically thought of as a technology for relating to life, right? In other academic contexts, an aspiring artist would have to learn to paint from a model, a sort of human figure, and would also need to learn how to paint still lives and other conventional genres that are all meant to hone a capacity to look at the real thing and to render it perfectly and beautifully onto the canvas. Now, what are some of the things, can I do a participatory? I'll pose a question and then answer it myself, and then we'll save real participation for the Q&A. What are some of the things we might notice right away about this fascinating anonymous portrait made by an aspiring soldier? One, there actually are no human beings in this painting, right? This is a painting of landscape without the actual bodily presence of anybody that would have otherwise been on these grounds. Two, the color scheme is wild, right? This rich red ground that seems almost surreal in its saturation. Well, a scholar named Wendy Shaw has spent a lot of time looking at these paintings, reading the instructions for officers, and finding the source material. And what she alerts us to is that, again, am I going to advance properly? Is that the Ottoman soldier training actually frowned upon painting from life. Our soldiers were trained almost immediately beside this part of Istanbul and did not go out to work in plain air. They worked from photographic intermediaries. And they worked perfectly from photographic intermediaries. It's astonishing how the internal ratios almost seem traced from this postcard. This allows us to see the selection of the red color as an interesting relationship to the reality of the soil there, which did have a reddish tint and apparently is fairly clay-like. So our artist, in working from a black and white photograph, color photography has not been invented yet, almost works like the colorist of the postcard on the right? The postcard on the right gets these hints of green and blue in order to sort of vivify it for the viewer who wishes to feel that they are present in this particular landscape. And on the left, our artist has fascinatingly done almost the same thing, taken the outlined information and then contributed what they know about the facts of the actual landscape and its qualities to the point of, to our eye, used to a different idea of verisimilitude, overplaying the fact of the red soil color in this new space of construction in the Ottoman capital. Now, Wendy Shaw's work highlighting for us how the training of officers is in many ways what she describes as a fairly orthodox training. We have modern viewers being taught modern ways of warfare, mapping the ground in ways that can actually condition and direct troop movement, but at the same time working through this photographic intermediary in order to keep the process of painting things in the world absolutely licit and without mounting a challenge to the idea of the original creator. If the camera is the first step to capture the world, our artist is simply rendering again that information without seeming to pose this theological threat. This doesn't suggest that every mode of artistry in the 1880s to 1890s requires that kind of double movement, but the official Ottoman military training would, because the Ottoman military reports back to the Sultan. So here we have a super modern painting where oil painting and photography are not solely functioning in order to capture the world better. They're actually doing, in a way, the opposite. They're providing these sort of protective moments in order to keep the chain of relationships of artist to world to God in the appropriate sequence. This is a fascinating counterclaim to many stories of modernity's entry into cultural settings that do not have a long history of oil painting on canvas. The entry of oil painting on canvas into a cultural setting is often pointed to as a colonial incursion brought in by colonial powers who require the subjugated populations to take on an utterly new convention in order to prove their civilizational status. what we have in the Ottoman Empire and what we have in the Qajar Empire are two empires that were not colonized, but who still had access and awareness of these new regimes of representation, trying to work out how they are going to use and circulate it. Now, this produces then fascinating tales of interior design, where well-to-do patrons, and here we're looking still inside the palaces in the royal complex in Istanbul. On the left, I'm showing you the interior of the kiosk of Osman III, which was first constructed in the 1750s under Mahmud I. And on the right, the privy chamber of Abdul Hamid I, constructed in the late 1700s, also in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Now, when we pay attention to how these interior spaces shifted and changed, we see that as a kind of refreshment of the interior decoration, our patrons replaced tile design and ornamental spaces with paintings in oil on canvas. So I've put this green box. These paintings on the left are newer additions, brought in, we think, in the 1800s in order to update. What you can see on the right would have been a place of niches for putting maybe porcelain or other goods, and then these bespoke sort of imperial tile commissions that would have filled the space with a kind of rhythmic set of interrelations without this kind of impetus to show real spaces, to show the world, to show landscapes. And it's the decision to bring in a convention recognized from royal settings elsewhere that we become interested in. So here we have patrons keeping pace with the existence of modern painting elsewhere, but how exactly do they, as viewers, relate to these kinds of spaces? You'll notice that the space in itself doesn't seem to have a single point perspective, which is what we often associate with a European convention of showing space, where there's a point on the horizon and everything converges to it. This, interestingly enough, is a relatively jumbled architectural space where arches are right on top of doors, and the entire configuration seems relatively flat, as if it would be difficult to enter. And Wendy Shaw's work has actually tracked that question of whether a patron living among these new landscape paintings would have felt that they could enter it, or would have felt that the landscape's oriented to their bodies, or did they have other modern relationships to that kind of representation? This would have been the relationship to a surface that preceded these kinds of representational paintings. This is a craftsman's design scroll from the 14th or the 15th century, we're not entirely sure, and it's showing a kind of geometric ornament known as the giri, or the knot design, where this would have the relationship of a design like this to space. It's that it's endlessly extensible. It's never bounded, and it doesn't have a single visual vanishing point that any viewer would relate themselves to. Instead, it's this sense of totality and extension. These kinds of tiled designs would have been used for the surfaces of religious buildings and even palaces. And then, again, we're working on this sort of threshold into modernity, thinking about what changed and how that also shifts subjectivities. We have spaces in the royal Ottoman palaces where, again, little tidbits of murals get introduced. So here we have the Felicity Gate at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul again. And the murals, and I've put a little circle around one of them here, in these sort of architectural spandrels that previously would have had that extensible ornament that we were talking about, here we have the placement of horizontal landscapes bounded and framed. Some more details so that you can see. Again, scholars have talked about how still, although there's the occasional introduction of a human or another, the real information here seems to be about space and about landscape. Does this look like a Turkish landscape? The answer is no. Fascinatingly, this is a sort of imagined landscape seemingly operating in a trans-imperial register, where the pastoral becomes available to those with power, regardless of the cultural origin, because these figures are traveling and have access to these sites of beautifully cultivated luxury. And you can see then, this is an enthronement scene painted by Constantin Campidoli, one of the very first oil-on-canvas works by an Ottoman subject. So this is a Greek Ottoman subject working in the court, and this enthronement scene of Sultan Selim III was painted around 1789 to about 1800. Now, what a fascinating enthronement scene. First of all, I hope you noticed right away, we have our two fascinating extraneous landscapes that are sort of bracketing the center of attention. You'll also notice, do you see the Sultan? Tiny, and in the very back, this is a painting where conventions of perspective are introduced. So we have a line of the attendants that are sort of foreshortened and getting slightly smaller toward the back. But the Sultan himself is remarkably small and unimportant by the sort of visual logics that we might otherwise expect for an enthronement scene. Typically, an enthronement scene would be organized so that your attention fixes upon the Sultan or the man being enthroned without the eye wandering. Here, our space seems to be more a space of all of the courtly activity, where even the oscillation of color competes with the red robes and the slightly larger sort of headwear of our Sultan Selim. Now, it gets even more fascinating. As photography enters, this space of enthronement, which already has competing modes of representation now represented, given space within it. We have the trans-imperial language of a landscape. We have the very format of oil on canvas, which bespeaks at least a kind of fluency in European modes of painting, now available and taken up by our Ottoman painter. And we have a relationship to the Sultan that doesn't aggrandize his body, but instead gives us the space itself of the court as probably most significant. And this sense that the body of the Sultan is less important than the notion of this kind of landscape and configuration actually gets even more complicated as we enter into the space of photographic representation. So what I'm showing you here now is a photograph from around 1890 of that same gate, the Felicity Gate, in the Topkapi Palace, which now includes, in addition to our landscape registers on the side, you remember that the Sultan was seated here, and he had to mark his importance. If I use this as I'll just use these. So to mark his importance, we had our carpet placed there as the sort of center where he would sit. Here we have the addition of further paintings showing the site where enthronement will take place, but not the Sultan. So now we have our horizontal landscape, we have the actual building, And we have a building that would have been associated, of course, with the carpet being placed here and the Sultan seated there and everybody organizing their activities around him, with the space itself as most important. And now we have an opening going the other direction that would also, because of the carpet laid down, we have now kind of double extension. If our Sultan, when he returns for these ceremonies, if he's seated there, we have our extension going this way to our photographer and members of the audience, and we have an extension going back this way with the Sultan at the very center. This is referred to sometimes as a mise en abîme, where we have two components and a strange void in the center. No body, a double opening nearing one another to sort of ramify the power of the space, where the person, or at least the representation of the person, is of the least importance to our artist, because the person will come and the person will leave. And our space has been established via these different investments in showing sites. So just to recap, we have our Ottoman soldiers working in their training register, their pedagogical register, thinking about how to show this royal landscape via photographic intermediaries. We have plenty of decorative arts also being produced via photographic technologies, reproducing the same Yildiz Mosque. And I'm emphasizing this building because we're going to see it again later in the lecture. We have regional painters working in the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. And what I'm showing you here is a painting by an artist named Tawfik Tariq, a Syrian painter, working at the turn of the century. This is a view just outside Damascus in a region called Dumar, which has been in the news recently, not at all for this, what Tawfik Tariq was interested in. He was interested in feats of engineering that were achieved under the Ottoman Empire. This is from 1908. Tawfik Tariq, a Damascus native, had gone to Istanbul to study painting. He received the same officer training, and as you can see, what is interesting to me is he's actually working as an engineer on the railroad as it's getting extended through the Arab territories, but his view when he paints is still a view that goes via the photographic. This is a man who's literally directing how the landscape's going to get reconfigured by his tracking, but his approach in relationship to the painted image is still this, what we might call orthodox view via a photographic intermediary. Now, one long text slide. I was actually asked just before the lecture if there were times when this problem of representation was addressed by modern actors. The problem of whether it is licit or permissible for those who are Muslims to make pictures or to make statues. And the most famous wrangling with that question is undertaken by Imam Muhammad Abdu, an Egyptian modernizing man of the faith, who in 1904 issued a legal opinion called a fatwa, endorsing the legality of images. And what's fascinating is 1904 is relatively late, given all that I have shown you, right? We saw that artists were engaging in making representations all along. But what the legal viewing actually does is to make it possible for more governments to actually create art schools. So the Egyptian art school is created in 1908, and its founding documents actually cite this ruling that states in the register of men of the faith interpreting the sources in order to make new determinations about kinds of activity. They state it as establishing the ground that allows the Egyptian government to actually invest in that way. And what I have extracted here, and I will read the key parts relatively quickly, is the crucial paragraph of Muhammad Abdu's ruling. Now, Muhammad Abdu was a sort of man of the world who had spent a great deal of time in Italy and was working assiduously in order to both modernize the faith and sort of work out what role the Arab territories were going to have under the Ottoman Empire. In 1904, there's already a sense among many that sort of wars over territory, and particularly over the Ottoman Empire, are imminent. And he says, what is the legal judgment concerning these images being representations of people and statues in Islamic law, if their purpose is, as mentioned, to depict human forms in their emotional reactions or physical postures? Is this forbidden or permitted? Is it reprehensible, deplorable, or obligatory? Must we make images? I would say to you that the painter has already painted and that the benefit is unquestionable and undisputed. The idea of worshiping pictures or statues has been wiped from people's minds. Nobody any longer feels that if they encounter an image, they're going to just start worshiping it as if it were a false god. And that's partly been achieved by photography by this point in 1904. He says, either you understand the judgment yourself after the case has become clear, or you raise the question to the mufti, and he will respond to you verbally. If you quote the hadith, and this is the section in the doings and the sayings of the Prophet most frequently pointed to as outlining the peril and the problem of making images, the hadith says, the most severely tortured people on Judgment Day will be the image makers. Or if he quotes other passages from the Sahih, another collection of the doings and sayings of the Prophet, he will probably say to you that this hadith came during the days of paganism. And so he's saying, if you currently ask the mufti, he will say all of those fears were back when there were active practices of idol worship. That's not the world we live in. Nobody feels that urge. And the benefit of images is that they convey knowledge to the next generation. So Muhammad Abdu says, we have to start preserving what we know from generation to generation. And we should do that by, of course, preserving our libraries, but also thinking about the power of images to convey those lessons to the next generation. This is our new obligation. It's neither reprehensible nor deplorable, and it's probably obligatory. And he says at the end, in general, it seems to me that Islamic law is far from prohibiting one of the best tools for learning after it has been established that it is not a threat to religion with respect to either doctrine or practice. And he goes on. So this was a two-page sort of ruling that appeared in a journal called El Manar, and it gave an explication of how this conclusion was getting reached by Muhammad Abdu, and it subsequently established an orthodox Sunni legal basis for governments to invest in the training and making of images, and to do so as a pedagogical relationship to those images. In Egypt, what we then get are works that are associated with the great early moment of Egyptian nationalism. This is a statue by Mahmoud Mukhtar, an Egyptian artist who studied in Paris, was sent to Paris to learn. It's called Egypt Awakening. It was first conceived of in 1919. This is a maquette that Mukhtar made while in Paris when a sort of revolutionary action was taking place in Egypt and nationalists were reclaiming sovereignty from the British sort of overseers that were present in the country. And then on the left, you see that the commission was acceptable to, again, these persons of authority, and was actually finished in 1928, unveiled in a city center in Cairo, and actually does remain in Cairo today. Now, the content is relatively fascinating. This is called Egypt Awakening. And you see, of course, a version of the Sphinx with its arms extending as if it were standing up from its slumber since antiquity. And a second idea of enlightenment or a rising, which is a female peasant figure raising her veil to the sun. So this is a completely modernist set of content where Mukhtar is thinking about what the nation's going to be like going forward, giving us iconic representation for to be placed in a public square so that citizens can sort of look at it and seek to accede to the promise that it offers. And at the same time, it's of course a very modern formal idiom with elements of sort of Art Deco and even Art Nouveau, which is appropriate to the time period when he was studying in Paris. Mukhtar was in the very first class of the Royal Art School set up in Egypt in 1908. He was recruited from a family of little means, and he becomes this sort of national figure, all via this important turn, responding to the ubiquity of images and thinking about how that shifts the threat that images might be worshipped and bringing an entire population of sort of pious citizens into a new regime of relationships to representation. I'm going to begin, even though I know that we need to take a break in about 6 minutes, I'm going to start so that I make sure that we make it through. I have 3 parts to the lecture, so we are now at the second. Light. So we were talking about light and pedagogy and photography, how to make an orthodox image, using photography and its mechanism of light in order to create a space to preserve knowledge. Let's now think about light as something fully manipulable under the modern conditions of the 20th century, right? With electricity, no longer is an artist or anybody else beholden per se to the cycles of light and dark. Instead, our entire capacity to see, let alone to represent, is something that we can, with much more active facility, control and reconfigure. My talk for today was electrical mosque lamps and electric hearts. And that is a reference to the Futurist Manifesto of Marinetti, which we are going to get to in a minute, but was also intended to prompt us to think about how even spaces of worship get configured through light, and then, in a way, reconfigured or networked in new ways through electrical light. So what I'm showing you here is an interior of the mosque of the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Cairo, which is a modern mosque built in 1828 at the time of Muhammad Ali and was designed by a Greek architect from Istanbul. So we have a kind of Ottoman register with Muhammad Ali as our Khedive, or new sort of claiming power in Egypt, and he constructs this mosque interior. Now, the actual structure of this mosque is very Ottoman in its formation. There's a central large dome, 4 heavy piers to bear the main structural load, and then sort of half domes that are placed on the corners to buttress that central dome. It's very tall, it's soaring, its prayer hall is oriented toward a Qibla line, but you can barely see any of that because of the astonishing lighting systems that are a feature of mosques in Cairo and elsewhere. This beautiful circular structure meant to mirror the dome, that's actually quite low in the prayer hall so that the lamps hang down and are very present and in fact do work to dissolve that structural information when one is praying. So the interior structure of these modern mosques is a structure where light is offering a kind of definitional, has a definitional function, and even provides a kind of center point, a counter center point for thinking about space and the relationship of a body to that space. Here, just a reminder of what it was like before electrical lights, we're looking at the interior of the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina. This is one of the holiest mosques. It is on the site of the very first mosque actually built by the Prophet himself. But we're looking at it, a postcard of it, in its 1908 configuration. Again, just think of the logistics, when not during prayer time, of lighting these fixtures that are so crucial to sort of orienting one's relationship to the space. Here we have our single caretaker. It feels like he might spend hours sort of lowering the lamp and trying to light the space. Well, in 1908, the Prophet's Mosque got electricity. And this was partial. First, just the electrical lamps in the central courtyard. And then from the central courtyard, the lamps were then brought into the prayer halls. What's interesting is that they start in the courtyard because the electrification project was part of the rail project, was part of the telegram project, and was part also of a project to reorient the service of the Ottoman Sultan to the communities of the faithful. What do I mean? We're actually looking at a clipping from the San Francisco Call in 1908, which I selected for our current location. And what this is reporting is, one, that the Ottomans have committed to running a rail line that will get pilgrims from Istanbul by rail down for Hajj, for their obligatory pilgrimage to Medina and to Mecca, doing away with the months-long caravans that were otherwise required, and making it possible to make a sort of planned, reliable, efficient journey. And that rail line was funded not by just the Ottoman state, but by actually taking subscriptions from Muslims all around the world who were committed to this idea of a kind of counter-technology for the faithful rather than for mere secular technology. And with it, as a kind of first step, was the running of the telegraph line all the way along that pattern. And then, of course, with the running of the telegraph line, then we can run other lines. And the ways of stringing the lamps actually allow for electrical power to make its way to the Prophet's Mosque as well. This is the line of the planned Hejaz Railroad. There was already the existing line into Damascus, and then from Damascus down along the Red Sea to make its way to Medina. Tawfiq Tariq, painting in 1908. Now that we return to this image, he's an engineer. I hope you probably noticed the first time, but now we can really see, you see the lines that are run, right? He barely cares about the train. So notice this tiny little train back here with its sad smoke completely dwarfed by the landscape. But boy, is he interested in these connecting insulators, right, that are going to allow that power to make its way to Medina and Mecca. With a renewed look at the interest of our regional painter outside of Damascus, thinking about the telegraph line. And the map that we saw showed that Damascus was this exciting starting point for that railway that was going to go down to Medina and Mecca. And what is wonderful and fascinating for us thinking about modern art and architecture is to then track some of the monuments that were commissioned and constructed in this same railway, telegraph, and electrical line. So I'm showing you here what is still referred to as the Telegraph Monument. This still stands in Damascus. It was built in 1904. It was commissioned by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and it was designed by an Italian designer named Raimondo da Ronco, who was an active employee of the Ottoman court, who was actively engaged in this period in producing festival designs and pavilions for the needs of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. This is a wildly unusual monument. At the top of it, as a topper, as the capital, we have a replica of that same Yildiz Mosque that we've been looking at in this lecture. And on its base, then, we have the telegraph with its beautifully then snaking lines from post to post, wrapping around the base like the vegetal tendrils around a post, but instead electrified sort of points of connection that then meet up at these nodes and then culminate in this architectural site of, again, sort of power and access that in Damascus is a fascinating transposition, right? Istanbul's not anywhere nearby, but that replica of that palace is then brought into this space. The photograph on the left was taken in Damascus around 1942, and on the right in the 1990s. And it is still there, and it's anchoring a sort of modern traffic circle in a subsequent urban plan to extend Damascus. Now, really quickly, da Ronco's fascinating as a figure working between sites within the Ottoman Empire. He first made a name for himself in 1902 in Turin, where you can see, again, this fantastic Art Nouveau design, seemingly based upon the beautiful visual formal conflation of electrical lines and floral expanses and vectors of energy. This is sort of the beautiful consummation of ideas of Art Nouveau. At the same time, in addition to designing this pavilion at an international exposition of modern decorative art, he was completing sort of imagined paper commissions for, again, the Ottomans. This is an 1893 sketch for a palace that was supposed to be built in Istanbul in 1896. That was going to be another international exposition of modern design. Unfortunately, an 1894 earthquake in Istanbul led to the cancellation of the actual fair, but what we have are an Italian artist thinking, the documentary evidence of an Italian architect's sense of the kind of festival architecture needed by our Ottoman Sultan. And we already saw the sort of sites of enthronement in the palace itself. This is a more public face for an international audience, thinking nevertheless about a kind of language of pavilions, flags, and tents as this temporary festival presence. Da Ronco then impressed everyone enough in 1893 that he began to take on commissions in Istanbul. This is a fascinating tomb complex for a Sufi sheikh who'd come from Libya to Istanbul and actually began to work with the Sultan to train him in a more mystical relationship to Islam. And when Sheikh Zafar passed away, this astonishing Art Nouveau building was designed by da Ronco, selected by the Sultan himself and constructed on the streets of Istanbul. This includes a tomb, a library, and a fountain. And again, Sultan Abdulhamid II actually selected it. Notice, again, this fascinating play with almost like electrical nodes, right? We have this sort of circle and lines connecting them, ringing the door like a force field. And then we have wrought iron details, which again seem to be mixing in highly modern ways the vegetal snaking of energy and growth, and then the sort of punched graphic design of a more mechanical modern language of ornament. This is what Daronco specialized in, and this is the language that he generated for the Sultan and then gave to Damascus to mark the next node in this sense of how a modern empire was going to sort of move on that technical power of communications and light outward into all of its territories at a crucial time of attempted consolidation. This sense of a dynastic commitment to connection and the relationships and exchanges between great powers consolidating by empire their territories is one that in the same moment extends to other empires, including the French Empire and its occupation of Algeria. So what I'm showing here are a set of images, one a photograph, one an imagined reconfiguration of the same site shown in the photograph. In 1857, you see a view of the port of Algiers. And on the right, 1865, we see a planned place for Napoleon III to appear, arrive, and enter into Algiers. Again, with all of this architecture being constructed in order to coordinate and visually organize that procession and that power. Now, you'll remember that France first entered Algeria in 1830. That was the start of the occupation, but in 1860, Algeria is actually announced to be made an integral part of France. No longer is it a mere colony, it's actually claimed as an extension of France. And there's a need then, through this architectural language, to assert and aggrandize that purported continuous relationship. Now, why is this relevant? Well, we have a French artist, theorist, and architect named Viollet-le-Duc. I don't know if anybody's studied him, active in the mid-19th century in France. And what we're looking at here is a design for a monument to Napoleon III meant to be placed in Algiers. I know. He made many, I'll stay close. So he made many designs. This was the one that was selected. It was not constructed, but look closely. Do you see a idiom of commemoration that we've already seen? This is earlier, but which we've seen already in the Marja Square in Damascus? Right? You see this? We have little tiny replicas of mosques getting imagined and used by a French imperial sort of thinker and scholar trying to imagine what kind of language would be appropriate in French Algeria. And the monument is fascinating for many other reasons. We have a sort of relationship to one kind of arch, almost maybe a Mughal arch, placed down here. So it's a real configuration of different decorative languages. But this mosque solution to redesign the classical column by a different belief system is a quite fascinating and equally appalling sort of claim to presence and power, authority, and right. And I hope you also notice we have a horse, a camel, and another animal here. So there's all of this play with triangulated relationships and powers as well. this idea of using the mosque as a civic topper continued to appear. So we have another French engineer, Arnaud D, proposing a bridge design for Istanbul to pass over the Bosphorus, and using again our miniature mosques as a sort of node for this territorial extension or connective lines between it. Also not built, but fascinating to imagine as a sort of imaginative investment in, again, what a modern gift of built environment what form it ought to take in a Muslim majority setting. Bizarrely, these mosques are not even Ottoman. They have a much more bulbous high dome, and they seem much more like Mamluk mosques. So this artist was probably also maybe servicing the Khedival order in Cairo and had honed his language in that sense. So there's not really a commitment to the local specificity of built design, but there's a real interest in the way that this larger Islamic extension ought to or could take form in, again, civic space. And the culmination, the one place where it seems to have really been brought in is ultimately then this telegraph monument in 1904. So again, this kind of idiom of thinking about how a civic language or a civic content is supposed to speak in a religious form is fascinating, and the French and Italian artists that were working on behalf of the Sultan were the ones in the lead articulating it. But of course, the Ottoman Sultan still takes on those commissions and takes on their arguments for the kind of transposition of an imperial center into other locations and their connections via technology. All of which, as promised, actually gets us to the futurists. I don't know how many of you have studied Italian futurism. Maybe not that many of you. Typically, this is one of the avant-garde movements in Europe that is best studied, most familiar, and offered in a kind of intro to modern art course. The theorist of futurism, or the man typically pointed to as the theorist of it, is Marinetti, and Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. And Marinetti actually grew up in Egypt, in Alexandria, was born there because his father had come as an Italian lawyer to help the foreign companies build the Suez Canal. So there's this, and he spent his whole childhood for 20 years in Istanbul before being sent to France. And the Futurist Manifesto is this ground-clearing, violent, aggressive statement against the past and against the gangrenous professors. I always remember that phrase because I'm a professor. The gangrenous professors who've saddled Rome with its own history. And that manifesto begins basically in Alexandria. I have the text up here. This is the start. We stayed up all night, my friends and I, under hanging mosque lamps, with domes of filigreed brass, domes starred like our spirits, shining like them with the prisoned radiance of electric hearts. For hours we had trampled our atavistic ennui into rich oriental rugs. It's maybe a drug-fueled jag at night with other adolescent boys who then issue this statement about destroying libraries, gangrenous professors, overturning the history in the name of speed and technology. But what we've been seeing up until now is that speed and technology is actually completely co-articulated with all of these historical forms. That Marinetti's language of staging that encounter under a mosque lamp isn't as weird as it might seem for an Italian. That actually the sort of Italianate articulation of Art Nouveau goes through our Islamic register and vice versa, and that Marinetti's presence even in Egypt when he's born is also part of this trans-imperial milieu just at our threshold into modernity. So this is, on the left, Marinetti, and then his father and his older brother staged, sitting around in their own home, apparently, which was filled with these mosque lamps. And the idea that the electric heart might come in to replace those mosque lamps, also in light of what we've been thinking about, circulatory systems, the ways that the mosque lamp was sort of contained and in a space, and how electricity actually networked even lamps to these grids, seems to me a perfect poetic distillation of this moment that we are at in 1904, that everyone's participating in, not just Italians or Frenchmen. Really quickly, it's not a coincidence that the famous works by futurists seem to fixate on light. This is by Giacomo Balla. It's called Streetlight. It's from 1909. And it is, again, seems to be precisely encountering a kind of new light, this electrical street light, and thinking about its strange effects where it dissolves itself and, again, enters maybe a technological field. Our futurist photographers were interested in using, again, this quality of light and the opening of the aperture in order to capture dissolving even bodies in the act of mechanized labor. Your hands move so fast, they become strange alien presences. And of course, you've probably seen works like this. This is by Gino Severini from 1912, and it's called Expansion of Light. So here the street lamp is completely suppressed, and all we have is an illuminating light and a sense of dynamism within it. This is all in the futurist register. Today we're also thinking about how we get at it through sort of modernizing Islamic world register, and what we'll see is that actually even the aesthetics end up looking somewhat similar and exciting once we get to the 1950s. Okay, so final section here, light, the camera and the body. We already queued up a few of these themes thinking about our enthronement of Sultan Selim III, where we suddenly had a space where we had an extension of a landscape in one direction and in the other, and no body at all. But let's turn now to the Qajar dynasty in Persia and think about what the camera and the photographic does for representations of authoritative bodies, of heads of state and heads of religion. This is a portrait of Fateh Ali Shah from, we think, 1798 to 1799, and well, two different ones. And the one on the left is actually installed inside the Golestan Palace. And the Golestan Palace is the main Qajar dynasty palace. It's a relatively modern space. And the one on the right was actually painted to be sent to other imperial powers. So the Qajar court sent this representation of Fateh Ali Shah to the directors of the East India Company in 1806. So you don't have time to make the diplomatic visit yourself. Commission these renderings, very schematic, conventional renderings in terms of sort of keeping his imperial dress, his comportment, his sort of presence, even the layout in place, commission one of those and send it abroad with emissaries to be sort of established in the courts of European nations or others. Notice I kept calling this conventional. What's conventional include the bodily pose, right? We already saw this. The knees, the sort of knees tucked under a relatively low throne, sometimes even just here, in both cases, a rug. Interestingly, there seems to be experiments with background. Even the incorporation of this kind of landscape background is an interesting signpost to us that we're entering a sort of place of modern exchange, at least. What happens when the camera comes? This is 1798. Cameras invented around 1830. When I teach this to undergrads, many speculate that the painters go out of work. It's not the case at all. What happens instead is that the two start to mutually constitute one another, and we see a dialogue where conventions of portraiture change, but the conventions of the photographic are also informed by the bodily poses in the paintings. So on our left, we have an early salt print from the 1850s of Nasser ad-Din Shah. Nasser ad-Din Shah was about 22 years old here. He looks much older, doesn't he? The weight of being the Shah obviously already weighing upon him. But we notice so many shifts here in terms of both the pose of the painting and the photograph. A sort of chair with much higher legs of a maybe just Western commodity design, an ease and a casualness of a pose with the sword, the hand placed on the chair, and of course, because the one on the left would seem to be in a kind of photo studio, or at least the controlled environment necessary to make the salt print, we don't have any of that attention to the background anymore. And the same is the case in the watercolor on the right, which, for understandable reasons, most art historians speculate used the photograph on the left as a kind of model. This painter is not interested in sort of reviving or following through the sort of ornate surface patterns of the palace that are shown here, and instead updates to a very modern, sort of streamlined kind of background for Nasser ad-Din Shah on the right. Now, photography also affected, but we'll return to portraits in a minute, also affected relationships to calligraphic works. I'm showing you here a page with an invocation to Ali ibn Hussein. So this is a Shia religious context in the Qajar dynasty. This was done in 1860, and it's ink and gouache on paper. And it's interesting for a variety of reasons. First, the artist Ismail Jalayir trained at the Dar el-Fanun in Tehran, where the camera had just been brought in and experts were working with it. So this is a calligrapher trained in a context of photographic technology, and that is being taught alongside the classical act of calligraphy. And you'll see, if you think about this as capturing light on surfaces, even, this is Ali here, even the sort of twists and turns of the letter form would seem to become reflective, right? So we have a suffusing light in the background coming in here, capturing and making flickering all of this information about built environment, about flora, fauna, gardens, and then the letters themselves seem to relate and reflect light in a new way. And then notice, we actually do even have a figural representation in this piece, where our grouping of Ali Hussein are actually placed alongside the name Ali, and all of them look like that salt print, this light suggestion where the photographic paper is not even getting fixed very well. And this is establishing a kind of light testimony through the photographic, expressing itself then around this calligraphic mastery, where Ismail Jalayir, who also does paint portraits, is thinking about how to bring that new relationship to bodies via light into these calligraphic representations. Now, the other wonderful thing about the Qajar dynasty, I emphasize that it was never colonized. The other sort of wonderful detail that allows us to pursue these thought experiments about modern art and architecture in the Islamic world is that Nasser ad-Din Shah himself became a photographer and an artist. It's very early on, a camera was gifted as an imperial gift. One came from Russia, and from the Russian Empire, and one, I believe, came from Italy. And Nasser ad-Din Shah learned photography and pursued photography as a courtly language, interestingly enough, almost of individualism. He produced self-portraits, which I'll show you in a minute, and those didn't circulate anywhere beyond his own court. So we have, unlike the kind of civic language we were just thinking about in the Ottoman dynasty, at least these case studies allow us to think of a kind of intimate idea of the self in relationship to photographic mediation. I'm showing you here an anonymous painting depicting Nasser ad-Din Shah, interestingly enough, posing twice. We have the photographer capturing his image, and then one art historian has said he's so important, he's also posing for a watercolorist who's then capturing the fact that he is posing for a photograph. So again, the ways that the painters and the photographers are actually working simultaneously and against one another is beautifully illustrated here. Also, look how, the portrait of the photographer sort of kneeling, trying to get as close as he needs to. There, again, an interesting intimacy in this circuit. And then the watercolorist places himself as the third term. And we have utterly schematic background and sort of floor, none of which is perspectival. Right? They're not converging on the point. This is sort of people and their activities and how they relate to one another that's getting shown. Sorry, I wanted to say just a few more examples of the way that watercolor and photography, again, are co-constitutive in a way. On the left, we have two different representations by an artist named Abul Hassan Ghaffari, who was given the honorific Sania el-Mulk, showing a prince, Ardashir Mirza. Oh, how do I get the, I do this? Yes, okay. Showing the same prince twice, and because we have two of them, again, we can become aware of some of the conventions here in this watercolor painting. Both of these are from the 1850s. You see the robe, which crosses over like this, has a billowy, thick shape. You can see the legs sort of lightly crossed. You can see that the watercolors include cartouches that explain the setting, give the name of the artist, orient us to the figure who's posing. Again, we have our landscape view outside the window, but as a sort of second disjunction and interest in thresholds as places that carry additional information. So here we have another signature. On the right, we have a portrait of Nasser ad-Din Shah, 1865, by a Armenian Persian photographer named Antoine Severguin. And notice that our pose of our Shah, he's seated in front of the peacock throne, not on top of it. He's seated on a chair like these other fellows who've been painted. Exact same pose, even the same. It's a relatively modern coat, but it has been oriented and posed just like in the watercolors. Let's get to the really interesting stuff. Nasser ad-Din Shah. These are two self-portraits by our Shah. They are wonderful for a variety of reasons. One, just the sort of panache, right? On the right, Nasser ad-Din Shah was very mobile. He made several trips to Paris. He was perfectly aware of the conventions of Parisian photographers like Nadar, and Nadar's own carte de visite sort of self-stylings, including a picture of Nadar in a hot air balloon. And here you see, that kind of rakish self-fashioning on the right, right? A leg out, our cane, our coat. On the left, a more conventional sort of still European-inspired, but military outfit. And the other amazing thing is that Nasser ad-Din Shah, after taking these photographs, mounted them in albums for himself and captions them. So this is, we understand down here, his own writing, and this is a court calligrapher's writing. The court calligrapher at the top identifies him as, in an honorific sense, giving his actual designations, and the captions in the, I don't speak Persian, I only speak Arabic, so I have to read them to you as I've written them here. The top left inscription, the calligrapher says the Shah as an all-knowing spirit. Bottom left, handwritten note. This is a photograph of me I took inside the palace. Now we're all laughing because it's wonderful to see such early selfies, and truly, truly they are early. Who else is going to have the means to take photographs only for themselves and not try to sell them? Or, this kind of intimate relationship to the technology is fascinating and rare. And the fact that our Shah was compelled to not just say this is a photograph of me, but also to say I took inside the palace, can be read in fascinating ways about a sort of consciousness of, again, space, presence in space, and the ways that space testifies to photography different than a body does, the need to caption the two, and the conjunction of the two as actually being the source of power for him as a sovereign. The one on the right says, this picture was made during the first 10 days in the month of Ramadan in the year 1284. That's a Hijri year, so he's using the Muslim calendar. I made this picture myself. So again, these kinds of testimonies to the maker, the creator, but of course he's not creating himself, he's already been created, and all of these circuits of creation and presence that we were already talking about become sort of wonderfully rich and complex in this not in this private photographic idiom. Severugin, who'd taken that portrait of Nasser ad-Din posing in front of the peacock throne, has also was perpetually documenting Nasser ad-Din Shah. So he documents himself, but he's also documented. And this is, again, a remarkable photograph for capturing relations between subject, seer, presence, and absence. This is Nasser ad-Din Shah at his desk, Hall of Mirrors, which is an astounding room inside the Golistan Palace, captured between 1880 and 1896. Do you see the Shah? There he is, at his desk, seated behind the desk. Do you see the photographer? Right? The photographer back here, we see his camera device on a tripod. And this actually should remind you of Las Meninas or other sort of great European paintings that are also playing between hierarchies of artist and patron, subject, and object. Nasser ad-Din Shah would appear to be far less important or meaningful to the documentary testimony of the painting than those relations, this giant mirror that reflects all of the other mirrored cut ornamental spaces at the top, this huge chandelier, this reflective glass, all of these surfaces working to refract and reflect so that the bodily presence is sort of suppressed to this testimony of the photograph to light, and to light in this room as part of the palace. How am I doing on time? Okay, I had, with the 5 remaining minutes, I was gonna show, in this lecture, I've really been focusing on the high Imperial register. and then some of the technical extensions into the Arab periphery of the Ottoman Empire. What's interesting in the Qajar context is that this same group of painters, the last name Ghaffari, the Ghaffari family, who are given honorifics, also are engaged in painting other spaces, of course, of dynastic importance in the Qajar setting. And so an artist who is known as Kamal el-Mulk, whose name is Mohammed Ghaffari, shows us here an image of the royal tekiya. Now, the royal tekiya was a permanent theater built in the round. Many people think on British models of theatrical space, meant as a way to focus attention on the taziyah, which are commemorative plays based on the narrative of martyrdom of Hussein at Karbala. So this is an event absolutely crucial in Shia faith, which as part of practice is revived every year and reenacted. And in this modern period of the late 19th century, the Shahs moved to manage those plays. These had been often popular plays out on the street, and an imperial theater was actually built very near the palace, where the sort of official version of those plays was to be staged. Now, the reason I'm showing this is, well, various, but one, look at how our artist, trained now via the camera, relates to light in this painting. What is the subject of the painting? Again, barely the people. The people are a sort of pattern at the bottom. We have this space is completely activated by this light ray that's coming in from the outside, thrusting across. We have the ornamental spaces also bringing light beams into the space. We have what appear to be probably maybe electric lights, maybe still oil lamps, also placed within the space. This sense of popular ritual, when rendered back into our imperial idiom, is still attending to those glass surfaces, to those light surfaces, exactly the kinds of surfaces that we were seeing within the palace, now seems to be informing the official view of these popular settings. This is a photograph of the same space, which makes for a pretty illuminating contrast. Again, look at how the light fixture ends up registering itself onto the portrait, or rather onto the photographic paper, like this ghostly apparition. And again, it becomes the central figure of this, of the testimony of this photograph. I'm not suggesting that the photographer intended that. I'm trying to prompt us to think about the ways that photographic technologies actually affect what is shown, what's perceived, what gets marked in our Qajar dynastic sense of its own holdings and grounds. This is by the same photographer, actually, so you can see what the plays were like actually by a participant attending them. We can still see all of the incredible lighting fixtures that would seem to mark the place as an imperial site with the means to do so. But of course, here we are now seeing the actual actors in that ritual reenactment of this foundational act of martyrdom. And even though we don't have time, of course, the photographic and the painterly are still coexisting with much more popular representations that include still these sort of coffee house format paintings and tile works that had always a theatrical component, were never thought to be autonomous testimony, and this would have been made for installation up at the top of these theatrical spaces. Okay, last comment about the Qajar dynasty, and then I'll make a final observation about a Turkish painter named Fahrenisa Zaid. We're looking here at probably one of the most famous Qajar paintings. This is by Mohammad Ghafari, Kamal el-Mulk, and this was painted just after he was given that honorific. It dates from about 1885 to 1890, and this is another representation of Nasser ad-Din Shah in that same mirror hall that we already saw him in when he was at his writing desk. It's another remarkable representation of a Shah in the sense that not only is our head of state shown very small, he's also shown turned away. And instead what we get is a room that almost acts like a camera. It has these open windows where light from the outside is coming in and pressing and registering itself against that closed interior. And our artist, who we already know is sort of trained in working with photographs, spends 5 years working on getting reflections as perfect and total and complete as he can, again, as a kind of testimony and portrait of Nasser ad-Din Shah, where the body is less important to than the camera-like testimony to the effects of this great environmental space, where every surface reflects another surface. I just wanted to conclude. My own research actually works in slightly later periods, at the mid-20th century, but I was so excited by what was in the Asian Museum collection that I wanted to use the calligraphic and the figural to take us through what I just spoke about. But to kind of bring us back to the idea of what a modern what a modern painting might be and how it might operate in an Islamic context, we started with Shakir Hassan el-Said, interested in the calligraphic and the abstract, and in an environment or a flat bed modern painting trying to register social conditions on its surface, almost like a wall. I wanted to just mention a fascinating artist named Fakhrenisa Zeid, born in Istanbul at the turn of the 20th century. Here we are looking at her when she's in her 60s. And this is her studio in Paris. This Turkish artist recently had a big exhibition at the Tate Modern. I don't know if anybody noticed that, but she's recently returned to the news. And Fakhrenisa Zeid grew up in a well-to-do Istanbuli family, and then fascinatingly got married to a Hashemite prince associated with the Iraqi monarchy, and spent then the 50s living in Iraq as a modernist painter and wife of a diplomatic figure who had different stations. So they were in Baghdad for a while and they moved around again. And what Fakhrenisa Zeid offers us are paintings of light and light effects that are meant to fracture the external carapace, as she sometimes put it, of bodies and things, and to open them up to vital movements and energies. Again, not unlike the sort of Art Nouveau mapping of technology into things and then back into technology. Fakhrenisa Zeid gives us these giant, lush canvases as a secular princess working between the Arab settings and Turkish settings, and the origin that she claims, and I know this is hard to see, but that's actually by design, was her time in Baghdad. This is her self-mythologizing, but she describes looking out the window, seeing people coming down the street in the particular quality of sun in Iraq, not found anywhere else, where the actual labor and movements of women carrying loads on their heads seem to be illuminated to a point of almost sacred disillusion. And that this visual experience of almost losing the body was so strong that that became the thematic that she would pursue over the rest of her career. And those representations then include trying to stake out relationships to mosques like we've been doing this whole time, where the mosque becomes a kind of anchor point for, again, a kind of illuminated, light-filled bodily environment that then is bracketed and opened up into a space of revelation or awareness, again, that transcends this sort of presence on the ground. So as I've looped through my 3 episodes, I've meant to introduce to all of us the ways that a modern painting like this, which has very little to do with the photographic, might still be thought to have come to pass through that technological pathway, through a question of orthodoxy, what it even means to make a body come into vision, and through the capacities of the photographic to highlight light as actual content rather than just medium for acts of artistic representation. So thank you for staying with me through these 2 hours.